This is Roger Clark, and I'm your host today on this episode of the Fourscore and 7 Project, a production of New Majority Foundation. A question that many Americans are asking today is, do we have confidence and faith in our elections? Most polling shows that somewhere between 1/3 to 50% of Americans believe that they do not trust the election process. Maybe many reasons for that, but this is critical because it raises the question that if you have a substantial number of Americans who don't trust and have confidence in the election process, do we have a viable representative democracy? Well, we're fortunate today to have someone talk to us about these issues, Derek Lyons. Derek is the president and CEO of RITE. That's an acronym standing for, and Derek, correct me if I have this wrong, but restoring integrity and trust in elections. Derek is a Harvard graduate, also a Duke graduate, I believe, so he's got some Southern education, Northeastern education in his blood, so he's well-rounded. He also has tremendous amount of experience in very senior positions on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. Derek, thank you so much for joining us today.
Roger, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So, Derek, tell us a little bit about the history of RITE, how it came to be, and where RITE is going.
Thanks. So, RITE was founded about a year ago, and the idea behind it is that citizens should have 100% confidence in their institutions of self-government, in their democracy, in the ballot box. And so the idea was to found an organization that would work to preserve elections as the democratic voice of the people. Elections are incredibly important, monumental events in a republic such as ours. They are the institution, the only institution really that ordinary citizens have to speak their voice and set the course of this great country, whether it's on the local level, the state level, or the federal level. And for that reason, because so many other institutions are controlled by the elites, but elections are controlled by the people, or should be, and therefore elections systems have to be designed and implemented and safeguarded so that the results reflect the will of our citizens and enjoy the full faith and confidence of the public. As you noted in your introduction, without confidence in the elections, it's hard to say we have a self-governing republic. Not only does it demoralize people and keep them away from the elections process, but it also makes it impossible to say that the elections ultimately reflect the will of the people. And so that's why we were founded, to try and make sure that this critical institution is preserved and serves that goal.
So, Derek, extraordinarily important work that you're doing. Can you give us some insight how you implement the goals that you seek to preserve?
Sure. So our organization works mostly through the courtroom or through legal processes. If it's not in the courtroom, perhaps in front of a state administrative agency like a board of elections. And we sort of operate with three pillars of our organization. So first of all, we try to defend state laws that we believe are lawful, consistent with state constitutions, federal constitutions, and that protect the integrity of the ballot box. The second thing we do is, once those laws are on the books, they have to be enforced. They have to be enforced even-handedly and according to their terms. And there's a lot of actors in the election system implementing those laws, and we will bring lawsuits or file complaints against election officials who, in our view, are deviating from the law, and ask courts to issue injunctions to bring them back in line. And then third thing we do is, there's a very well-funded industry out there that is seeking to tear down these laws. And so in the course of defending them, these election integrity laws, we're also looking at these tools and trying to make sure they're not abused. Take the tools out of the toolbox from the left, so that they can't sow this mistrust in our elections, like they've been doing, and cast aspersions on election laws that are really only there to ensure that at the end of the day, uh, there is a well-defined result that enjoys the confidence and trust of the citizenry.
So Derek, on this issue, one man's election integrity is another man's voter suppression. How did we get to this?
Yeah, I think one way we got here is that we've lost sight of what elections are supposed to be, and they've turned into really sort of pure partisan power plays. So, when we step back and we think about elections being the institution that ordinary Americans have to speak to their government to say, this is how I want to be governed. I have a view about the course and direction of the nation, and I want to speak it, and I want to say that. Uh, you know, those are that's something that's controlled by the people, that's for the people, and it's not. It may have partisan outcomes, but it's not a partisan exercise. And I think what's happened is, because there's so much power that is allocated on the basis of these elections, partisan actors have gotten in there, and they want to paint people in black hats and white hats. And they feel very comfortable casting aspersions on normal, everyday Americans who want nothing more than a clean, fair election process run by the rules. And they want to inflame passions, and they feel comfortable casting their fellow citizens, neighbors, friends as vote suppressors. And it's really unfortunate, in an era where it's never been easier to vote in this country. Now we have weeks in many states of early voting. We have no excuse mail-in voting in many states. Many states have extremely low bars to registration. Some states even have no registration requirements. I think in North Dakota, some states have same-day registration. The point is if you today have a view about the direction of this country and want to express it, the obstacles to you doing that are very low. And the laws that we defend and the laws that we seek to enforce are democratically popular laws put in place by democratic actors, elected representatives, in response to their constituents saying, for us to have confidence in the outcome of this election, we want to be sure that the people who show up to vote are who they say they are. So we want voter ID, we want signature matching, we want ballot integrity measures. Those are the things that we want, so that we know that the outcome of this election is what people say it is. And it's not an unreasonable request, and I think it's a little beyond the pale, really, to call it vote suppression.
Well, you mentioned voter ID, and from my perspective, the issue of voter ID is ground zero on the debate between voter suppression and election integrity. Earlier this year, I believe, the state of Ohio passed a voter ID requirement. I understand there's been some litigation associated with that. Is RITE involved in any of that litigation?
We're supporting a couple of citizens in Ohio who have also worked as election workers to come to the defense of that law alongside the state of Ohio, the the Attorney General of Ohio, and the Secretary of State of Ohio. And I think, let's take a step back on voter ID and just let's think about what it's trying to do. It is trying to make sure that every person who shows up to the ballot box is the person they say they are. And that's a very reasonable request for people to fulfill. It doesn't, and it's not an overly burdensome one. In state after state where we've have photo ID put in place, the elections in those states are running fine. It's not Democracy has not died in those states, and for the most part, every person who wants to vote, and again, speak their voice into into that election can satisfy these requirements, whether it's, you know, a U.S. passport, a driver's license, another form of state ID. And the list goes on. And in many states, they've even taken the the step of saying, if you are willing to show up to vote and tell us and sign your name to a certification that says, I just could not get this ID, even
Hmm.
though it's readily available and free, and you sign your name to that, you get to vote there too. So
Hmm.
I think this notion that it's, somehow suppressing the vote, again, is meant to rile up partisan passions and, make the elections itself, the mechanics of the election, yet another ground for partisan battle in this country. And it really shouldn't be that. We all agree that the person who shows up to vote should be that person, and it is not an unreasonable thing for the state to verify that as
Hmm.
uh, as that process is taking place.
Well, a wonderful thing about the federalist system that we have 50 laboratories, 50 separate laboratories, and quite a few of those laboratories, meaning states, have voter ID requirements. And I suspect that there are statistics out there that we could go to each of these individual laboratories where voter ID is required, and other laboratories, again, states, where voter ID is not required, and we can do a statistical comparison on voter turnout. Do we have any data like that to compare voter turnout in those different type of laboratories?
Sure, there's somebody could do the work. I think one of the things with voter turnout is you end up with a lot of confounding variables that really distort the analysis. So, the main drivers of voter turnout are, it seems to me, one, the culture of voting in that particular state or jurisdiction. So, for example, Minnesota has had historically high turnout for a long time. They liberalized their voting laws, and I think turnout sort of stayed high. I'm not sure they saw an appreciable increase. In other states, uh, sorry, another driver of turnout is, of course, going to be candidates from election to election. So, we saw big spikes in turnout in 2016, 2018, 2020 compared to, the previous presidential or midterm before that, and it came down a little bit in 2022. I think pinning this on the laws that are in place in any particular state is probably, you're probably looking at inframarginal impacts to turnout, because I think what really drives turnout is, you know, do you think your vote counts, and do you want it to count, and do you have something to say about the
Hmm.
government in your
Hmm.
state or your country?
Hmm.
Um, you know, some states have had photo ID, like Virginia, and then not had it. My guess is, if you looked at the data, turnout went up, but only because the elections after they got rid of it were these sort of very intense elections where people had a lot to say about the direction of the country. And I think it probably had very little to do with, that Virginia didn't have voter photo ID in place for those elections. So I think, turnout is an interesting measure of the health of our democracy. I think it's an important one. I'm not sure we've come up with much that's better, but disaggregating and dissecting the elements of turnout, I think ultimately doesn't have as much to do with these background laws as one might think.
Well, the law in Ohio was a law passed by a democratically elected legislature, signed into law by a democratically elected governor, and it apparently has been challenged in the courtroom. As what is the basis to a challenge? How would that legally be classified in a court of law?
Sure. So, the basis of this. So let me take a step back for a second. Um, Photo ID is interesting because it's sort of this boogeyman. It is the alleged sine qua non of voter suppression. You ask somebody to verify their identity at the ballot box with a photo ID, and according to some folks on the left, according to our current president, this is the reinsertion of Jim Crow into the United States.
Hmm.
But really, it's overwhelmingly popular with people. Um,
And it's very
Democrats,
common
Republicans.
throughout the planet, I believe, isn't it? Most republics do have voter ID requirements.
it's extremely common throughout the world
Right.
where there's voting taking place, but it's also in this country. It's dramatically popular. Overwhelming bipartisan majorities of people support photo ID, and it's not hard to see why. They want some assurance that the people who are showing up to vote are the people who say they are, and overwhelmingly they are. And so just but verifying that is something that people want. It's something that people say gives them
Sure.
faith in their elections. So in this particular case, to circle back to your question, uh, the allegation is that imposing a photo ID requirement um, undermines the fundamental right to vote, the First Amendment based fundamental right to vote that every citizen of this country possesses by virtue of their citizenship and the First Amendment to the Constitution. And this is a this that's the nature of the claim, and the way that it's
Hmm.
evaluated is under a balancing test where you look at the burden that's being imposed, which we say is extremely minimal, against the benefit that's to be achieved, and we say in the government's interest in imposing that requirement, which we say is quite high, if for no other reason, and there are other reasons, but if for no other reason that it is a means of giving people confidence that the election that takes place is in fact legitimate. That
Hmm.
gives them confidence that they can wake up the next day, hear the results, and say, okay, this is how my fellow citizens wanted our state to be governed. This is how these are the types of representatives my fellow citizens wanted to send to Washington. And, maybe I'm happy with that, or maybe I'm disappointed in that result. But because there were safeguards in place, I know that that process had integrity. And then I can go about my life being a citizen and not worrying about,
Hmm.
is somebody trying to steal elections?
Is there any court anywhere in the United States that has held a voter ID requirement as being an impermissible burden on the First Amendment right to vote?
So these challenges often fail. Most states have been successful in defending their photo ID requirements. It, I believe the Fourth Circuit struck down a photo ID requirement a few years ago, maybe about 10 years ago, and I believe it was on these grounds. There may have also been some additional grounds, but the point was is that I think what the court determined was it wasn't easy enough for folks to get the right type of identification at that time. I think that was a contestable conclusion, but in any event, that's what the court concluded. Virginia later rectified that. What the court said was a deficiency, and its next iteration of the law withstood challenge. So I think we can say going back to 2008 when the Supreme Court blessed um, Indiana's photo ID requirement, the default presumption is really that these laws are constitutional, and it takes quite a bit of a showing for the other side to take them down. But that doesn't stop them from trying every time they're enacted.
Well, with the Ohio case, is there some effort to have a preliminary injunction before the final ruling to prohibit the enforcement of the voter ID law?
No, the other side, they filed their lawsuit and they've been content to see it progress on the ordinary timetable. And so, in fact, um, Ohio has an election. They just had a primary election that was conducted under this new law and seems to have gone fine.
Right, right.
They didn't seek to enjoin the law for that election. So really, they're really after here is they want to change the results, not of primary elections so much as again, it's a partisan ploy to tilt the playing field in favor of their more liberal substantive agenda.
Right, right. Well, see, November 2024 is looming on our near future. It's on the horizon. Is this an issue that you think is going to get resolved in Ohio before the 2024 presidential election?
I expect it will be. The court seems to be proceeding apace. I don't think it will
Right.
linger, uh, through the next election. And I fully expect that election will be conducted with photo ID in place in Ohio.
Well, you also mentioned another term, and just kind of shift the crosshairs on this from voter ID because you mentioned signature verification. The statistics seem to indicate now that maybe only about 1/4 of voters show up on election day to vote. 40–50% of the people now vote by mail-in, and most places determine the validity of those ballots based upon a signature verification. Walk us through that a little bit. How does a signature get verified when the mail-in ballot is received to make sure that it's the true and accurate vote of the person it purports to be from?
So thanks. Yeah, this signature matching is, an important ballot integrity measure in states that have it in place. Not every state has it in place. Some of the more liberal states will just accept a ballot that has a signature that purports to be from the voter, but it doesn't compare to anything, before that ballot is counted. Other states have moved past signatures to alphanumeric codes that are put in place on registration and then matched with the ballot. Usually, this is driver's license numbers
Mm-hmm.
or some other
Mm-hmm.
form of some other number that's selected by the voter.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but where it is in place, and then where it is in place, it varies in terms of how it's implemented. Some states like Nevada run run it through machines first, and then where the machine identifies a discrepancy, some humans will take a look at it, and usually it's two or usually it's more than one person, and they sort of try to come to an agreement, and there's a process beyond that if there's not an agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And then for the most part, uh, the ballot's not rejected if the signature doesn't match, but the voter's contacted and they try to divine the provenance of that ballot.
Right.
So it's a lengthy process, but why is it important? Well, you know, without it, there's really no assurance that the ballot came back from the person it was sent to. Ballots get sent in some states, live ballots will be sent out to every registered voter on a list.
Mm-hmm.
Many of those will land in PO boxes or vacant lots, uh, apartment buildings that people have moved from, and these ballots can be returned by anybody, who's willing to sign their name, subject to the penalty of perjury, of course. But
Mm-hmm.
um, with enforcement being what it is, there's that's the only check would be some law enforcement official noticing something has gone wrong and doing something about it. But with signature matching, you can see the ballot come back, you see the signature on file, and what they basically look for is sufficient points of comparison. So do the loops look the same? Do the R's generally look the same? Uh, and for the most part, if there's sufficient similarity, the ballot goes through. And if there's not, and people agree, or people can't agree on it. Again, there's typically a curing process
Right.
that will either try to rehabilitate that ballot before it's excluded.
Well, I find it hard to believe that there are enough handwriting experts, in the country to have professionally trained people comparing these signatures. What kind of qualifications or training do the people who are actually doing the comparison have to make sure it's an accurate comparison?
Well, again, it's going to vary from state to state. So, in Nevada, they do have these machines that take the first cut at it. After that, there's a fair amount of, I think, training that the election workers go through. I think the rigor will depend, from state to state. But the point is that a ballot's not being excluded, just because there's no sort of forensic analysis on it. For the most part, they're looking for a few points of comparison that give the folks enough confidence that it, more likely than not came from the person it purports to be from. And then if not, reaching out to that person to give them an opportunity to confirm, no, that's my ballot,
Right,
and
right.
put it in the ballot box.
Well, you mentioned, I want to just dwell on this other point for a minute. You mentioned that some states have an alphanumeric match. Describe that. How does that work?
Yeah, so I think so. For example, Georgia, you know, had a lot of trouble with its signature matching. I think, somewhat famously in 2020, um, you know, ballot rejection rates went way down in Georgia, and there was, some concern that the signature matching process had gotten too loose, that they were clearing they were determining matches in more cases than they had in the past. But that so what they did is the legislature got to work. It said, signature matching is important. It's the thing that, you know, ensures us that the ballot came back from the right person. But is there something better we can be doing? And I think what they put in place is, an ID number, the driver's license number, so that, when you fill out your absentee ballot, you
Hmm.
put your driver's license number. Uh, when it comes in, it's a much more objective comparison. They just look to see if the numbers match, and if they do, that ballot's cleared for the certification process.
So has
So it's
that has it?
it's a more objective
Yeah.
process.
Has that been described as voter suppression or Jim Crow 2.0?
Yeah, so all those laws in Georgia are subject to litigation right now. I mean, this is
Right.
all part of what's called the SB 202 litigation.
Yeah.
It's pending before the federal courts in Georgia right now.
Yeah. Do you think we'll have a resolution to that before the November 2024 presidential election?
I do. That case also seems to be proceeding apace. The
Hmm.
question of full resolution is a little more challenging because
All right.
there's appellate courts, and you never know if they're going to take the case, on an emergency expedited time frame or not. But I do
Sure.
think we'll have at least, an initial cut at it from the district court by then.
There's some tension between voter ID requirements and all these very huge mail-in ballots because we're talking about signature verification, maybe an alphanumeric in Georgia, to verify that the ballot is from the person who it purports to be from. But are there any states that require a photocopy of the driver's license or the voter ID to be returned along with the absentee ballot?
Yeah, so I think Wisconsin does that, and one other state, I believe, but Wisconsin for sure. So they're requiring photocopy of the ID to be returned along with the ballot. And
Hmm.
again,
Hmm.
you know, this is just a way to ensure that the ballots are coming back from the people that they're supposed to be coming back from.
Hmm. Hmm.
As more voting moves out of the ballot box, we need to continue to be sure that the ballot box is being protected, because
Hmm.
again, it is it's the institution we have to set the course of the country, and we should be enforcing the rules around it so that everybody after it happens can have confidence and trust that you know that the way that this country is going to be governed is the way the people want it to be governed.
Well, that kind of brings us to the issue of what's called ballot harvesting. California has kind of been in the forefront of this ballot harvesting program where individuals can go out and collect a number of ballots from others. Generally, I think in the past, some states allowed family members to return other family members' ballot, but California has opened it up where it's much broader than that. And there's a lot of concern that the ballot harvesting destroys the concept of a secret ballot because there could be direct interference between the person harvesting the ballot and the voter, some influencing exercise in a private room or an office or wherever that contact may take place. Or I think even in North Carolina, I think it was the ninth congressional district a couple of years ago, there was some hanky-panky, so to speak, where harvesting was going on, but the ballots were being falsified, and that all got worked out in the wash through litigation. But your thoughts on ballot harvesting, the threats that ballot harvesting poses to the sanctity of fair elections?
Sure. So, I mean, I think actually North Carolina example is a great one because not for the country, but it didn't really get washed out in litigation. They ended up running a whole new election. They determined that
Mm,
election was
right.
irredeemably tainted by fraud, and they had a special election to elect a new representative. I think ballot harvesting, ballot trafficking. Um, this the this is something that one as you mentioned, resulted in a very serious uh, flaw in an election that seriously undermined its outcome, and nobody should have had faith or confidence in that election, and indeed they didn't,
Right.
and they reran it.
Right.
But also, it's an intrusion uh, on the secret ballot. We fought people fought in this country for a long time to say the vote must be private. It needs to be protected from outside influences, and we were willing to go to great lengths to do that. And so we put people, in individual booths behind curtains, and we make it clear that election officials or people around aren't supposed to be near the voter while they're voting, and then they put it in the machine themselves, and then it's stored in a secure box, and whenever it's actually touched by anybody, it's at that point it's been anonymized. But ballot harvesting sort of takes that away. I mean, in theory, ballot traffickers are only taking completed ballots, but the truth is we don't know what happens
Mm-hmm.
behind the
Mm-hmm.
scenes. We don't know what
Mm-hmm.
happens when people go around canvassing neighborhoods for ballots, and you
Mm-hmm.
know it because we don't know, we can't say that we still have a secret ballot really in this country. I think another thing I'd like to say about ballot harvesting and ballot trafficking is that it's just the abuse, I think, of what started out as a good idea, a well-intentioned idea, which is that some people do need help with their ballots. Some people need help in the ballot box, if they're in the poll box, and they're allowed to have people there to help them, whether it's to read or translate or
Mm-hmm.
something like that.
Mm-hmm.
We know that some people need help voting, and as we've expanded into mail balloting, we know that some people need help with their ballots. But it's a huge jump to go from helping your family member, return their ballot, somebody who perhaps they're confined to their bed or something like
Mm-hmm.
that,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to sort of this sort of blanket assumption that, well, we all sort of need a little help with our ballot. Like, who isn't too busy to do all the daily tasks of life? And if somebody shows up and wants to collect your ballot, all the better for it. So what if they're paid by the party? So what if they're
Mm-hmm.
paid by people with certain interests?
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
know, give them your ballot; they'll help you out. These people need assistance too. You know, there's a certain amount of work that's involved in
Right.
the project of self-government. We all need to do what's required to be heard, to participate in the process. And so, what they did is they took an idea that was designed to help people who truly needed it, basically expanded it into a loophole, and now it's a get out the vote operation. And it really
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't be that
Mm-hmm.
way. The
Mm-hmm.
people who
Mm-hmm.
want to speak to and have their voices heard in the government should do so, but they should follow the rules and participate through one of the many easy ways to do so in each state across the country. And it's not too much really to ask people to return their ballot, or at most to hand it to a relative or a friend to return for them. But this sort of large scale ballot harvesting, as I said, one, we know that it is susceptible to fraud, and two, it undermines the secret ballot, which has become a core tenet of our democracy.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it doesn't have to be, but it is now, and I think
Mm-hmm.
most people agree that it should be.
Well, I believe there's 8 states, at last count anyway, that have 100% mail-in balloting. There's a number of states that have no excuse absentee balloting. I think there's still 16, 17 states where you either need to be ill, disabled, or out of the county on election day in order to request an absentee ballot. Then there's a host of states that no excuse, just send me the absentee ballot. But there's a number of states, 8 of them, California is one, where all the ballots are mailed to all voters. So you have 100% absentee balloting automatically, which raises the question of the reliability of the individuals who are receiving these ballots. California has a lot of people leaving the state now. They're registered voters. They could be in Nevada. They could be in Texas. They could be in Kansas, Washington, Ohio. We don't know where. But yet you have someone that's still registered in California. They may be registered now in the state of their new location. So they could have two votes. They may have two votes. It's illegal, but you could cast two votes. The question I have for you, though, with that background, is there any process where we have any type of uniformed purging of voter rolls that can cross-reference between the states? We certainly have the technology to do that. The question, do we have the willpower to do it, or the coordination amongst the states to do that?
Yeah, so this is something that we're working on. The answer is not really, unfortunately. For starters, some courts have said that it's perfectly fine and reasonable for people to maintain registrations in two separate states, which we disagree with. You know, you to vote in a state, you're supposed to be resident in that state. Establishing residency for voting purposes is not particularly difficult, but you should only be a resident of one state at a time. And so,
Mm-hmm.
for starters, it just isn't even the case that, being registered in two states is seen as problematic by some, including some courts. Uh, Additionally, cleaning the voter rolls has been it's a full-time endeavor for some very passionate people who work in my space, who, friends and colleagues of ours. And they do great work, but at the end of the day, many states voter rolls aren't as clean as they should be.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned, people move, so they've left a state. People
Mm-hmm.
die. Um, people Some people surrender their registration, but
Mm-hmm.
beyond that, the the in states where live ballots are going out to full voter lists, we just know that they're piling up in places where they shouldn't. And these are not
Mm-hmm.
ballot applications. These are votes that if they come back and they have a signature and let's say it matches or is close enough to matching, or even some states that don't have the match,
Mm-hmm.
that ballot comes back, it goes in the ballot box. Nobody knows where it came from. Nobody knows if it came from a person who was formerly a resident, or if it was voted by somebody on behalf of their deceased relative, or anything else. And none of that should be happening. So we do have, the technology does exist that would help us um, better identify suspect registrations, flags, that could then be investigated. But the legal framework has not caught up, and one of the reasons is the political will is just not there for people to make cleaning up the voter rolls a priority at the federal level, or even at the state level. So the truth is that our voter rolls are not as clean as they should be. Some states do a better job than others, um, but I think in some states they're they're content to focus their efforts elsewhere, and it's not clear to me why. I don't know why we would want live ballots going out um, to addresses where people may not live anymore, to vacant lots, to PO boxes.
Right.
Uh, none of that makes a great deal of sense to me, and we could clean it up if we had the national will, or on the state level, the state will to do it. But it doesn't seem like it's there.
Well, one thing you just said, and I want to pause on this because this is just shocking revelation. So I could legally vote in California and Nevada, at least according to some courts. I can vote in both places and incur no criminal liability for that.
I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. You could be registered in both places. You're not supposed to vote in both places.
I see.
You're
I see.
supposed to vote in only one of them. But the truth is if you're registered in both and you voted in both, we don't have great mechanisms, at
Right.
least to my knowledge, to identify those people. So for example, a college student who is in Pennsylvania, but from Texas, and gets a mail ballot from Texas and walks into a ballot box in, um, you know, somewhere in Philadelphia or anywhere else in the state. They're not supposed to do that. They're not supposed to vote under both registrations. But I'm not sure it would be very easily caught or identified.
Well, if my constitutional law serves me right, that the place, timing, and manner of elections are supposed to be determined by the individual states. So if we wanted to have a mechanism where all 50 states could keep track of the movement of voters and how they're registered, it would require some cooperation amongst the states, which the states don't necessarily have to provide, it seems to me, or some type of federal law, which may raise some constitutional implications on whether it's enforceable or not. What do you think about that?
Sure. So Congress does have the power under the Constitution to, put some uniform system in place for this. I think we want to be careful about that, though. One of our great safeguards is these laboratories that you mentioned earlier, and that states do ultimately control their elections. And remember, most elections are for offices that are not federal. They're for a variety of state offices that differ from state to state. Each state has a different culture around voting. Each state, the people in each state believe different safeguards are needed. The people, as I mentioned, of North Dakota have been perfectly content without a system of registration, although they do have a system of identification on the back end. Other states have a registration system plus a photo ID system, with no excuse or absentee voting or some other system. So, I think that we want to be careful with imposing a federal solution on this. The states can get together. They have. I mean, there have been efforts to do this. The ERIC system has been in the news quite a bit lately because this was supposed to be an interstate effort to clean the voter rolls. So, person moves to another state, they register. Derek Lyons pings the system. Where did he come from? He came from Texas. Texas, hey, we've got this Derek Lyons with this type of social security number registering here. You may want to contact him, make sure he wants to be off the rolls in Texas. But this too ended up being a system plagued by partisanship and is sort of fallen apart because more liberal states were using it as a means to identify what they call eligible but unregistered voters. And to contact them, to sign them up, and get them into the system for voting, which is in this country, we should want people to participate in the election because they want to participate in the election, because they have something to say about the election, not necessarily because the government got after them and cajoled them to become a voter and have a voice. The voice should precede the voting and the registration, not sort of the other way around. But in any event, it wasn't doing a lot to clean up the voter rolls for a variety of different reasons. And some states protested and they asked ERIC to reform itself to do a better job of engaging in this interstate cleanup initiative. And the organization, kind of refused. And so we have this situation right now where states are withdrawing from ERIC, I think largely as a protest, because it was supposed to be this system that helped clean up the voter rolls, which is a critical element to election integrity. And it was sort of co-opted and turned into something else. And so it remains to be seen what happens. I think there's people out there trying to propose new solutions as ERIC, it's ERIC, as it falls, as it sort of comes apart a little bit. But
Right.
to be seen. I mean, it's a big gap that states and secretaries of states really should be focusing on.
Well, before I let you go, what do you see on the horizon for RITE in 2024?
So we're active in about 10 states with about 10 different lawsuits going on, and we're going to keep pounding away at that and expanding our docket. Our mission as we go into 2024 is to do everything that we can to make sure that we have established rules in place that are protecting the integrity of the ballot box, and that those rules are enforced, so that when everybody sends in their mail ballot or goes to the polls early or votes on election day, very shortly after that, we will see the results. We will know, who is going to be the president of this country for the next 4 years. We'll know who our senators are going to be, who controls the Senate, who controls the House, at the state level, who our governors are. What we want is we want to know those answers as quickly as possible, with as little controversy as possible after the election. And so we'll be active in state courthouses and federal courthouses across the nation to do our level best to lay the groundwork for an election that Americans can have confidence in.
Well, Derek Lyons, President, CEO of RITE, Restore Integrity and Trust in Elections. Thank you so much for your time. I hope to have you back sometime.
Would love to. Thanks for having me.
Take care.
You too.